The air inside Aurelia was not merely air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, thick with the scent of old money, Bulgarian rose perfume, and the earthy ghost of black truffles. It was a place where silence was the most expensive commodity, broken only by the reverent clink of silver against porcelain and the hushed murmurs of men who moved markets with a single word. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, honeyed glow that made every patron look like a figure from an old-world painting. Ilara Vance moved through this gilded sanctuary like a phantom, her presence defined only by its function. Her black uniform was a void against the room's opulence, her movements economical and precise, a ballet of practiced servitude. She refilled water glasses crafted from Venetian crystal, her reflection momentarily captured and then dismissed in their flawless surfaces. To the titans of industry and finance who dined here, she was invisible, a necessary but unnoticed part of the intricate machinery that made their world run so smoothly. She had perfected this invisibility, honing it into a shield that protected the raging, brilliant inferno of the woman who lived inside the uniform. Every polished glass, every perfectly placed fork, was a small act of defiance against the chaos that had shattered her life. Within the fortress of her mind, a different world existed. As her hands performed the rote tasks of her station, her brain, a finely tuned instrument of academic rigor, was constantly cataloging, analyzing, and dissecting. She would note the way a powerful CEO's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wine, a tell of a deal gone wrong. She would deconstruct the brushstrokes of the massive oil painting on the far wall, a supposed Gilded Age masterpiece, recognizing it instantly as a high-quality but modern giclée print. This secret knowledge was both her torment and her solace. It was the last remnant of the life that had been stolen from her. A life where she was not Ilara the waitress, but Ilara Vance, Yale's most promising doctoral candidate in art history, a prodigy with an almost supernatural ability to spot a forgery. That life had ended 5 years ago, the day her father, a man whose soul was intertwined with the beauty of the art he curated, was publicly destroyed. His gallery, his life's work, was bankrupted by a sophisticated art fraud, a scandal so meticulously orchestrated it left him in ruins. The public shame and the crushing weight of his lost legacy had broken his heart, leading to a massive stroke from which he never recovered. Now Ilara's world was a grueling cycle of double shifts and sleepless nights. Every dollar she earned funneled toward the tuition for her younger sister Emily, ensuring that at least one of them would escape the wreckage of their family's name. Her father's ghost was a constant companion in this opulent tomb. As she cleared a plate of half-eaten Dover sole, the scent of lemon and butter would momentarily transport her back to his workshop, to the familiar, comforting smells of linseed oil and aging canvas. She could almost feel the dusty warmth of the afternoon sun slanting through the gallery windows, illuminating the vibrant pigments of a Renaissance panel he was painstakingly restoring. He had taught her to see the world not just for what it was, but for the stories hidden beneath its surface. He taught her how to detect the subtle anachronisms in a forger's work. The telltale trace of titanium white in a painting supposedly from the 17th century, the uniform striations left by a modern power tool on a block of marble meant to be from antiquity. This education, this incredible gift he had given her, was now a useless secret language in a world that only valued the surface. It was a skill that paid nothing, a bitter irony that gnawed at her as she served men who wouldn't know a real masterpiece from a cheap imitation, yet owned both in abundance. Her motivation was a quiet, burning coal in her chest, to keep her sister safe, to honor her father's memory, and to one day, somehow, reclaim the truth of his legacy from the lies that had buried it. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. This is a story of justice you will not want to miss, a testament to the fact that true power is not always the loudest voice in the room. It is often the quietest, the one that has been listening, waiting, and remembering everything. The story of Alara Vance is a reminder that the most formidable weapon is a mind that has been sharpened by loss and fueled by a love that death cannot extinguish. Her journey from the shadows of a gilded restaurant to the blinding spotlight of truth is about to begin, sparked by a single, careless act of cruelty from a man who believed he was untouchable. He was about to learn that underestimating the invisible is the most fatal mistake a powerful man can make, for it is in the shadows that the most dangerous truths are forged, waiting for their moment to be brought into the light. The hushed reverence of the dining room was shattered not by a loud noise, but by a shift in the gravitational field of power. Alistair Finch did not simply enter Aurelia, he conquered it. He moved with a predatory grace, his custom-tailored suit, a sheath of dark gray armor that seemed to absorb the light around him. A platinum watch, worth more than Alara's annual salary, glinted on his wrist like a manacle of his own success. The restaurant's manager, a man who normally exuded an unflappable Gallic charm, scurried towards him, his posture instantly transforming from one of authority to one of anxious supplication. Finch didn't acknowledge him with a look, merely inclining his head a fraction of an inch as he was led to the best table, the one nestled in a secluded alcove with a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. He moved as if the world were a tedious obstacle course designed for his personal navigation, and the people in it were mere scenery. He looked through the staff, his gaze passing over them as if they were furniture, their humanity entirely irrelevant to his existence. Alara felt a familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach, the instinctive reaction of prey sensing a predator. This was not the casual arrogance of inherited wealth. This was the cold, calculating dominance of a man who had built an empire by devouring others. Seated at the table, Finch's disdain for the world around him became a performance. He was dining with a potential business partner, a quieter, older man with watchful eyes. Finch immediately took control, waving away the sommelier with a flick of his wrist before the man could even speak. He ordered a bottle of wine, a rare Bordeaux, mispronouncing its name with a confidence so absolute that it dared anyone to correct him. He then launched into a monologue about a recent hostile takeover, his voice a low, self-satisfied rumble that carried through the quiet alcove. He spoke of the company he had just acquired not as a living entity made up of thousands of human lives and decades of history, but as a collection of underperforming assets and redundant headcount that needed to be streamlined for maximum shareholder value. He spoke of people's livelihoods with the detached cruelty of a surgeon discussing a necessary amputation, every word dripping with the casual contempt he held for anyone he deemed beneath him. His partner listened silently, his expression unreadable, as Finch laid out his philosophy of power, a brutal doctrine where empathy was a liability and morality was a luxury he could not afford. Alara, standing a respectful distance away, felt the words like tiny, sharp stones hitting her. She had heard this language before, in the sanitized, sterile news reports that had described the restructuring of her father's life's work. The main courses were cleared, and the moment for the final act of the negotiation arrived. Finch leaned forward, a conspiratorial gleam in his eyes. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small, velvet-wrapped object, placing it in the center of the table with the reverence of a high priest revealing a holy relic. This, he announced, was the, quote, miracle cure to seal their partnership, a tangible symbol of the trust and value he was offering. He unwrapped it to reveal a small marble sculpture, no more than a foot high, of a young boy. It was exquisite, or at least it was meant to be. Finch began to weave its story, his voice laced with the faux intellectualism of a man who had memorized a sales pitch. He spoke of its supposed origins in a 15th-century Florentine workshop, its journey through the hands of dukes and cardinals, its incredible survival through centuries of war and upheaval. He was selling not just a piece of art, but a narrative of power, history, and exclusivity, using it as collateral in a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Alara moved to refill their water glasses, her movements fluid and silent, her presence meant to be as unobtrusive as the air itself. It was then that he saw her. His eyes, cold and dismissive, flickered over her, and a cruel, knowing smirk touched his lips. He saw her uniform, her name tag, the water pitcher in her hand, and in that single glance, he summarized her entire existence and found it wanting. He paused his speech, turning his full attention to her, a predator playing with its food. "The provenance is complex," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear clearly, a deliberate act of public condescension. "It involves the Medici banking collapse of the late Quattrocento. Far too boring for your simple little world, I'm sure." The insult was designed for maximum effect, to simultaneously impress his partner with his esoteric knowledge and to reinforce the unbridgeable chasm between his world and hers. To twist the knife, he used a highly specific, obscure Italian art term, sprezzatura, but he used it incorrectly, applying it to the marble's finish instead of a courtier's demeanor. He looked at her, waiting, expecting her to blush with ignorance or simply nod dumbly, a blank-faced servant in a world she could never comprehend. For a moment, the world stopped. The clinking of distant cutlery faded. The hum of the city outside vanished. Finch's words did not just insult her intelligence. They were a direct, profane echo of the very forces that had destroyed her family. He spoke of banking collapses and forged histories as a casual boast, the same tools of financial and cultural warfare that had been used to murder her father's spirit. An arctic coldness washed over Ilara, a fury so profound it felt like absolute stillness. Her hand, holding the heavy crystal pitcher, did not tremble. It became perfectly steady. In her mind's eye, she saw him, her father, standing in the echoing empty space that was once his vibrant gallery. His shoulders slumped, his face a mask of gray disbelief. She saw the newspaper headlines screaming words like fraud and disgrace next to his kind, honest face. She saw the auctioneer's gavel fall again and again, each strike a hammer blow to her family's heart, selling off their history to strangers. The man sitting before her, this arrogant, preening titan of industry, was not just a rude customer. He was an archetype. He was the embodiment of the faceless, soulless power that had crushed her world. The smirk on his face was the same smirk she had imagined on the faces of the men who had profited from her father's pain. And in that moment, something inside Ilara Vance, something that had been dormant and grieving for 5 long years, finally snapped into place. The shield of invisibility dissolved, and the brilliant, formidable expert she had buried alive began to claw her way to the surface. A silence profound and absolute fell over the table, a vacuum that sucked the very air from the opulent alcove. It was a silence more deafening than any shout, a stillness born of pure, unadulterated shock. Finch's condescending smirk remained frozen on his face for a heartbeat, a grotesque mask of arrogance that had not yet received the news of its own demise. For Ilara, the world had telescoped down to a single, sharp point of focus. The background noise of the restaurant, the distant murmur of conversations, the soft melody of a string quartet, it all dissolved into an irrelevant hum. Her awareness was entirely consumed by the man before her, and the cold, hard memory of her father's face, ashen and defeated, in the sterile light of a hospital room. The insult, meant to be a casual flick of a wrist to dismiss her, had instead struck a tripwire deep within her soul, one connected to 5 years of repressed grief, silent fury, and the burning, ceaseless ache of injustice. A current of ice-cold clarity shot through her veins, extinguishing the last embers of fear and servitude. Her hand, which had been poised to pour the water, moved with a new, deliberate grace. It was no longer the hand of a waitress. It was the hand of a surgeon, an academic, an expert. The heavy crystal pitcher was placed soundlessly on the white linen tablecloth, its placement as precise and considered as a brushstroke on a masterpiece. Her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible change that nonetheless altered the entire dynamic of the space. Her shoulders, usually held in a posture of professional deference, straightened. Her spine became a rod of steel. She lifted her chin, and for the first time that evening, she made direct, unwavering eye contact with Alistair Finch. Her eyes, which he had previously looked through as if they were glass, were now obsidian mirrors, reflecting his own stunned expression back at him with an intensity that was unnerving. The invisible woman had suddenly, terrifyingly become solid. The air around her seemed to thicken, charged with a power he could not comprehend. This was not the defiance of an insubordinate employee. It was the calm, lethal focus of a predator that had been lying in wait, perfectly camouflaged, and had just been presented with the throat of its oldest enemy. The years of swallowing her pride, of burying her intellect beneath a veneer of quiet competence, of channeling her brilliance into the mundane ballet of service, had not weakened her. They had tempered her, sharpening her mind into a weapon of formidable precision, and now, that weapon was aimed directly at the heart of the man who had unknowingly forged it in the crucible of her family's suffering. Her lips parted, and the voice that emerged was not the one she used to ask patrons about their water preferences. It was a different voice, a voice that had been dormant for half a decade, a voice that belonged in lecture halls at Yale and in the hallowed archives of the Uffizi Gallery. It was low, resonant, and carried the effortless authority of absolute knowledge. She spoke in fluent, academic Italian, the syllables flowing with a liquid precision that made Finch's earlier clumsy attempt at the language sound like the braying of a donkey. La sua comprensione della sprezzatura è, con rispetto, fondamentalmente errata, she said, her tone level and coolly analytical. Non si applica alla finitura di un oggetto, ma al comportamento disinvolto di un cortigiano. Un errore comune tra I dilettanti. Her words hung in the air, each one a perfectly polished stone cast into the silent pool of their arrogance. Finch's partner, the older, quieter man, blinked slowly, his gaze shifting from the sculpture to Ilara, a flicker of genuine curiosity and perhaps respect in his eyes. Finch himself simply stared, his brain struggling to process the cognitive dissonance of this waitress, this non-entity, deconstructing his carefully crafted persona with the casual ease of a master dismantling a child's toy. He had intended to use a foreign language as a wall to exclude her. She had just turned it into a cage to trap him. She then seamlessly transitioned to perfect, unaccented English, her voice retaining that same chillingly calm and incisive quality. Her gaze dropped from his face to the small marble sculpture sitting on the velvet cloth, the so-called miracle cure. That is not a Medici-era piece, she stated, not as an opinion, but as an incontrovertible fact. The statement was delivered with such finality that it left no room for debate. It was as if she had declared the sky was blue. She raised a single, steady finger, not touching the sculpture but hovering just above it, her gesture that of a professor indicating a crucial detail to a classroom of students. The striations in the marble, particularly on the underside of the base and within the folds of the drapery, are far too uniform. They are consistent with the use of a high-speed, modern carbide drill, likely fitted to a pneumatic tool. A 15th-century chisel, even in the hands of a master, leaves subtle, idiosyncratic imperfections. It leaves the ghost of the artist's hand. This piece has no ghost. It is a hollow, modern thing, a soulless copy of a memory. Her description was so vivid, so precise, that the other men at the table could almost see the high-speed drill biting into the stone, feel the absence of the master's touch she spoke of. She continued, her voice a relentless, methodical scalpel cutting away every layer of the fiction Finch had so carefully constructed. And the patina, she added, her eyes lifting to meet his once more, a glint of cold fire in their depths. It is meant to suggest 500 years of oxidation and handling, the slow accumulation of history. But it is sloppy work. The darkening is too even, lacking the subtle variations one would find from exposure to different environments over centuries. It is a chemical compound, a potassium permanganate solution, artificially aged with a blowtorch to create the superficial crazing. It is a cheap, common trick, one favored by a particular school of forgers operating out of Lyon in the late 1990s. Her knowledge was not just academic, it was encyclopedic, specific, and utterly damning. She was not merely identifying a fake, she was narrating its fraudulent conception, revealing the cheap tricks and sordid shortcuts used to create the illusion that Finch had been trying to sell as priceless history. She was exposing the lie in its most intimate, technical details, leaving him with no defense, no plausible deniability. The foundation of his power play was crumbling to dust before his very eyes, dismantled by a woman in a black uniform. Then came the final, devastating blow. The name that had been a curse whispered in the ruins of her life. The name that her father had spoken with a broken heart just before the stroke silenced him forever. She looked directly into Alistair Finch's eyes, a connection of pure, distilled animosity passing between them. The specific techniques, the particular chemical signature of the artificial aging, the stylistic preference for Florentine subjects, it is the unmistakable signature of the forger Jean-Luc Vacher. For a moment, she let the name hang in the charged air, allowing its significance to settle. Finch's face, which had been a mask of crimson fury, was now draining of all color, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. He recognized the name. Of course he recognized the name. It was the name of the artist, the criminal, the tool he had used to build a part of his empire on the rubble of other people's lives. And as he stared at her, a dawning, horrified recognition began to flicker in his eyes. He was not just being corrected by a waitress. He was being confronted by a ghost from a past he thought he had successfully buried. Ilara's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it carried across the table with more force than a scream, a whisper freighted with the weight of 5 years of pain. "My father," she said, her voice perfectly controlled, betraying none of the seismic grief that was breaking inside her, was a man named David Vance. He owned the Vance Gallery on Madison Avenue. He lost everything, his reputation, his business, his life, because of one of Vacher's fakes. A fake that was planted in his collection, a fake that was used to orchestrate a scandal that allowed his assets to be seized. The personal became political, the abstract became visceral, the entire table was now a tableau of stunned silence. The miracle cure, the symbol of Finch's power and influence, had been revealed as a cheap poison, and the woman he had tried to humiliate was not just an expert who had caught him in a lie, she was a victim of his crimes, the living embodiment of the collateral damage he had never bothered to account for. The confrontation was no longer about a piece of marble, it was about a shattered life, a stolen legacy, and a daughter's memory. The silence stretched for 3, 4, 5 eternal seconds before it was violently shattered. Alistair Finch slammed his fist down on the table, a sudden, explosive act of violence that sent silverware rattling against porcelain. The sound was like a gunshot in the serene dining room. A deep, guttural roar of pure, primal rage escaped his lips, the sound of a king whose crown had been snatched from his head by a peasant, his face contorted into a mask of such venomous fury that it was barely human. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated, untouchable titan of industry dissolved in an instant, revealing the ugly, insecure bully beneath. His eyes, now bulging with rage, were fixed on Ilara, and in them she saw not just the humiliation of being exposed, but the terrified fury of a man whose entire fraudulent world was suddenly threatened by an impossible, unforeseen variable. He had built his life on the principle that people like her did not matter, that they were invisible, silent, and powerless. Her very existence, her knowledge, her voice, was a refutation of his entire worldview, and he could not bear it. He did not deign to speak to her directly. To do so now would be to acknowledge her as an equal, to validate the power she had just seized. Instead, he snapped his fingers with a crack that made the manager, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, jump as if he had been struck by a whip. The manager scurried over, his face a mess of terror and confusion, his eyes darting between his apoplectic billionaire patron and the preternaturally calm waitress. Finch pointed a trembling finger at Ilara, his hand shaking with a rage so profound it defied control. "She is fired," he snarled, his voice a low, menacing rasp, each word dripping with venom. "Now! Get her out of my sight." He then leaned closer to the terrified manager, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening hiss that was somehow more frightening than his roar. "Or I swear to God, I will personally buy this restaurant by tomorrow morning, and by Friday, its smoking ashes will be the foundation for a new parking garage. Do you understand me?" The threat was not hyperbole. It was a promise, and both men knew he had the capital and the sheer malice to make it happen. The manager, a man named Jean-Pierre, who normally prided himself on his unflappable composure, was now pale and sweating, his professional poise completely shattered. He turned to Ilara, his eyes pleading, terrified. He avoided looking at her face, instead focusing on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Mademoiselle Vance," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, you must leave. Now, your things, they will be sent to you." There was no argument, no investigation, no hearing her side of the story. In the brutal calculus of power that governed this world, her truth was irrelevant. Finch's wealth was the only fact that mattered. Ilara looked at the terrified man before her and felt not anger, but a distant, hollow pity. He was just another cog in the machine, another soul bought and paid for by the power of men like Finch. She gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of regal acceptance. She did not offer a word of protest or defense. There was nothing left to say in this room. The truth had been spoken, and the consequences were now in motion. She turned her back on the table, on the shattered sculpture, on the sputtering, enraged billionaire, and began to walk away. Her walk out of Aurelia was the longest journey of her life. Every eye in the dining room was on her. The hushed murmurs that had been the restaurant's lifeblood had ceased completely, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Patrons lowered their forks. Conversations died mid-sentence. They all stared, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a kind of morbid curiosity. They did not know what had happened, but they knew they had just witnessed a fundamental law of their universe being broken. An invisible person had spoken back. A servant had toppled a master. Ilara walked with her head held high, her back straight, her steps measured and even. She did not rush. She forced herself to meet the gazes of the other diners, refusing to be shamed. She was not the one who should be ashamed. Inside, her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and a cold dread was beginning to seep into the edges of her fury. But on the outside, she was a statue of composure, a queen walking away from a battle she had already won. Even in defeat, she passed through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air, the sounds of the restaurant finally fading behind her. The moment the doors swung shut, the immense weight of what she had just done crashed down upon her. The manufactured composure dissolved, and her legs felt suddenly weak, threatening to buckle beneath her. She leaned against the cold brick wall of the building, the rough texture, a grounding sensation against her back. The sounds of New York City, the blare of horns, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of pedestrians, rushed in to fill the silence. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and the raw, chilling terror of her new reality. She was unemployed. Her last paycheck would barely cover her rent, let alone the next installment of Emily's tuition, which was due in less than a month. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, a wave of despair washed over her. She had thrown away her livelihood, her sister's future, for a single moment of defiance. Had it been worth it? The image of Finch's humiliated, enraged face flashed in her mind, and a grim satisfaction answered her question. Yes. It had been worth it. It had been worth everything. She pushed herself off the wall and began to walk, her destination unknown, her mind a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts. The city lights blurred through the unshed tears that now stung her eyes. She replayed the scene in the restaurant over and over, but her focus was no longer on the sculpture or her own words. It was on his face. Alistair Finch. The name echoed in her mind, colliding with fragments of memory, with the faded yellow clippings of newspaper articles she kept in a box under her bed. The articles about her father's ruin. She remembered a small, grainy photograph of the executives of the holding company that had acquired the gallery's assets for pennies on the dollar after the bankruptcy. A younger man, his face full of the same predatory arrogance she had just seen up close, had been at the center of the group, Alistair Finch. It was him. It had been him all along. The faceless villain who had haunted her family for 5 years, the architect of their destruction, was not a ghost. He was a man who ate at Aurelia, a man who mispronounced French wine labels and used Italian art terms incorrectly. A new energy surged through her, a force that burned away the despair and left in its place a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was no longer just about a moment of personal vindication. It was not a random encounter. It was fate. It was a chance, a 1 in a billion chance, to finally confront the source of all her family's pain. The loss of her job was no longer a catastrophe. It was a liberation. She was no longer bound by the need to be invisible, to be silent. She was free, free to fight back. Her grief, which had been a heavy shroud for so long, now felt like armor. Her father's memory was not a source of pain, but a wellspring of strength. She would not let his legacy remain a footnote in the story of Alistair Finch's ascent. She would make it the headline of his downfall. A plan, vague and unformed, but brilliant and terrifying in its audacity, began to coalesce in the depths of her mind. She would not be a victim anymore. She would be a hunter. She stopped in the middle of the bustling sidewalk, oblivious to the pedestrians swerving around her. She reached into the pocket of her simple black coat and pulled out her old, cracked smartphone. Her fingers, which had been trembling moments before, were now perfectly steady. She scrolled through a list of contacts she had not dared to look at in 5 years, a digital graveyard of the life that had been stolen from her. She passed names of old classmates, fellow academics, friends who had drifted away after the scandal, unable to stand being near the taint of failure. She was not looking for them. She was looking for one name, one man who had never believed the lies, one person who had known her father's integrity and her own brilliance. Her thumb stopped on the entry, Professor Alistair Albright, her thesis advisor at Yale, a giant in the world of art history, a man whose reputation was unassailable. He had been furious at the university's and the art world's abandonment of her father. He had called her a dozen times after she dropped out, but she had been too broken, too ashamed to answer. Now she was no longer ashamed. She was armed. She pressed the call button, her heart pounding a steady rhythmic drumbeat of purpose. The phone began to ring, the sound tinny and distant in the cacophony of the city street. Each ring echoed in the vast emptiness of her uncertainty. Would he even remember her? Would he believe her? Would a man of his stature risk his reputation on the word of a disgraced former student turned waitress against one of the most powerful and litigious men in the country? She held the phone to her ear, the cold plastic pressed against her skin, and listened to the ringing, a sound that held the entire weight of her past and the fragile possibility of her future. The fight for her father's name, for the truth, for justice, was no longer a distant, impossible dream. It had begun tonight, in a gilded restaurant, with a single, quiet sentence. And whether it would end in victory, or in her own complete destruction, depended entirely on the voice that might, or might not, answer on the other end of this line. The ringing stopped. She held her breath. The phone connected on the third ring, a voice crackling to life across the city, a voice she had not heard in 5 years, but one that was etched into the very fabric of her academic soul. Professor Albright. It was a voice that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, a voice that could dissect the history of a single brushstroke for an entire semester. For a paralyzing second, her own voice caught in her throat, a knot of shame and grief and years of unspoken failure. She was no longer his brilliant protege, the student he had once called a once-in-a-generation talent. She was a waitress, calling from a noisy sidewalk with a cracked phone screen and a future that was a terrifying, formless void. But then he said her name, Ilara, and the warmth in his tone, the immediate, unqualified recognition, was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for half a decade. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. He remembered. He had not forgotten her. The world, which had felt so vast and hostile just moments before, suddenly felt a little smaller, a little less lonely. There was at least one other person on the planet who knew who she used to be, and who might just believe in the woman she was about to become. Their meeting took place the following afternoon in his office at Yale, a cramped, chaotic space that was the complete antithesis of Aurelia's gilded prison. There was no curated silence here, only the gentle hum of a radiator and the rustle of turning pages from the graduate students in the library next door. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper, leather bindings, and brewing coffee, a perfume of knowledge that felt more like home to her than any place she had been in years. Books were not decorations here. They were a living, breathing part of the architecture, stacked in precarious towers on the floor, spilling from shelves, their spines cracked and worn from use. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a tall, grimy window, illuminating a world of intellectual pursuit, a world she had been exiled from. Professor Albright, a man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that still held a fierce scholarly fire, sat behind a desk buried under a mountain of manuscripts, looking at her not with pity, but with a deep, palpable concern that felt like a physical embrace. This was a sanctuary, a place where truth was valued more than wealth, and for the first time since she walked out of Aurelia, Ilara felt the fragile stirrings of hope take root in the barren soil of her despair. She told him everything. The words tumbled out of her, at first hesitant and disjointed, then with a gathering momentum, a torrent of suppressed history unleashed. She described the quiet humiliations of her job, the constant, grinding effort to remain invisible while her mind screamed with observations she could never share. She recounted the scene with Finch, her voice growing stronger, steadier, as she detailed the technical flaws in the forgery, the precise chemical compounds, the telltale signature of the modern tools. As she spoke, she felt a subtle transformation within herself. She was not just recounting a story of a wronged waitress. She was presenting a case, laying out evidence with the academic rigor he had taught her. The memory of her father, which had so often been a source of paralyzing grief, now became a wellspring of authority. She spoke of his expertise, his integrity, his unwavering belief in the power of beauty, and she channeled his spirit into her own words. She was no longer just his grieving daughter. She was his academic heir, the living repository of his knowledge, and she was finally using the gift he had given her as the weapon it was always meant to be. Professor Albright listened without interruption, his steepled fingers pressed against his lips, his gaze never leaving her face. He did not seem surprised by her story, but rather grimly vindicated. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the office, broken only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. He leaned back in his creaking leather chair and let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound weariness and righteous anger. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "That man is a vulture in a bespoke suit. He has been a rumor in the darker corners of the art market for years, a ghost who finances frauds and then profits from the chaos they create. But he is brilliant at covering his tracks. He uses proxies, shell corporations, legal firewalls. He is untouchable." Albright's words were a sobering dose of reality, but they were also a validation. He believed her. He was not just humoring a former student. He was confirming the existence of a known predator. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes and leaned forward, his own eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce intensity. "But you, Ilara," he said, "you are not a rumor, you are a witness. And you have something no one else has ever had, a direct link, a personal connection. You saw the weapon in his hand. He stood and began to pace the small space, his energy suddenly filling the room, the old scholar transforming into a seasoned general planning a campaign. He explained that a direct assault would be suicide. Finch's legal team would bury her in lawsuits, discredit her as a disgruntled, unstable former employee seeking revenge. They couldn't fight him in a courtroom, not yet. They had to fight him in the court of public opinion. They needed to dismantle his reputation so thoroughly, so publicly, that his business partners and the federal authorities could no longer afford to look the other way. He stopped pacing and turned to her, a plan already forming behind his eyes. "We need two things," he declared. "We need a weapon, and we need a battlefield. The weapon is the truth, your truth, but it needs to be sharpened, backed by irrefutable proof. And for that, you need a journalist, someone who knows how to dig into the labyrinth of offshore accounts and shadowy holding companies." He scribbled a name and a number on a piece of paper. Marco Rossi. He's a bulldog, an investigative reporter for the Sentinel. He specializes in financial crime. He owes me a favor. Tell him I sent you. He will be your guide through the sewer. The second thing we need is leverage, Albright continued, his mind clearly working several steps ahead. We need an inside source. Someone who can corroborate your story about Finch's methods from within the system he manipulates. He paused, tapping a thoughtful finger against his chin. There was a man, a curator named Julian Croft at the Met. A good man, a brilliant scholar. Finch served on the museum's board for a few years, a typical act of philanthropic camouflage. He and Croft clashed constantly. Finch saw the museum's collection as a portfolio of assets. Croft saw it as a sacred trust. Finch eventually had him pushed out over a trivial acquisitions dispute. Croft was professionally exiled, disgraced. He hates Finch with a passion that would make a volcano seem cool. He might be willing to talk, to point you toward other skeletons in Finch's closet. Albright handed her another piece of paper with another name. This was the beginning of her new life, a life of shadows and whispers, of hunting for ghosts in the digital and physical world. She had walked into this office a fired waitress with nothing but a story. She was walking out as the leader of a burgeoning insurgency, armed with the two most powerful weapons she could have asked for, a mentor who believed in her, and a strategy to begin the fight. Marco Rossi's office was a controlled storm of information. Located in a grimy building in Hell's Kitchen that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, it was the polar opposite of Albright's academic sanctuary. The walls were covered in sprawling whiteboards, a chaotic spiderweb of names, dates, and company logos connected by angry red lines of string. Photographs of powerful men in expensive suits were pinned to the boards, their smiling faces marked with question marks and circled in black ink. It was the physical manifestation of a relentless, obsessive mind. Marco himself was a man who seemed to be powered entirely by nicotine and righteous indignation. He was wiry, with tired, bloodshot eyes that missed nothing, and he listened to Alara's story with a practiced, cynical stillness, his expression betraying nothing. He had heard 1,000 stories of corporate malfeasance, 1,000 tales of the rich crushing the powerless. He was not easily impressed. He needed more than a story. He needed a thread, a single, verifiable thread that he could pull to unravel the entire tapestry of lies. Alara understood this immediately. She was not here to appeal to his sympathy. She was here to prove her value as an asset. When he expressed his skepticism, questioning how they could possibly prove the sculpture was a fake without the object itself, she calmly opened her laptop. For the past 2 days, fueled by coffee and a burning need to act, she had been working. She had compiled a dossier, a presentation that would have earned her a doctorate. Using high-resolution press photos of the gala where Finch had previously displayed other pieces from his collection, she began a systematic, academic demolition of his entire artistic empire. She pointed to a Roman bust, supposedly from the Antonine dynasty. She highlighted the tool marks around the ear, consistent not with a Roman bow drill, but with a modern rotary tool. She showed him a medieval illuminated manuscript, pointing out the use of a synthetic ultramarine pigment that wasn't invented until the 1820s. She was not just making accusations. She was teaching him a new language, the language of forgery, the secret grammar of lies written in stone and oil and paper. She was giving him a master class in her unique, formidable skill. Marco watched, his initial cynicism slowly melting away, replaced by a dawning, predatory excitement. He was a hunter who had just been handed a map to a hidden, untapped hunting ground. He finally understood. Ilara was not just a source. She was a key, a human cipher who could unlock secrets that were hidden in plain sight. He stood up and walked to one of his whiteboards, uncapping a black marker. Alistair Finch's name was already at the center of a large, intimidating cluster of corporations and offshore accounts. Marco tapped the name with his marker. "The problem with this guy," he explained, "is that he's insulated. Every asset is held by a different shell company in a different tax haven. The money moves through a dozen digital hands before it lands. We can't get to him directly, but your forger, this Jean-Luc Vacher, he's a direct link. He's a supplier. If we can find him, and if we can prove he supplied Finch not just once but multiple times, we create a pattern. We establish a conspiracy to commit fraud. Vacher is the thread we can pull." Their strategy solidified, shifting from a vague desire for justice to a concrete, actionable plan. The first objective was clear: find Jean-Luc Vacher. Marco warned her that Vacher would be a ghost. Men like him did not have public profiles. They lived in the shadows, operating through middlemen and false identities. He gave her access to several powerful research databases, the kind that cost news organizations thousands of dollars a year to maintain. He showed her how to search international shipping manifests, auction house private sale records, and Interpol watch lists for art and antiquities crimes. He set up a burner phone for her and gave her a prepaid credit card with a few $1,000s on it for expenses. "This is your life now," he told her, his tone grim but not unkind. "You're a ghost hunter. You'll be spending your days and nights sifting through mountains of digital dust, looking for a single, actionable footprint." He did not promise her success. He did not promise her safety. He only promised her that if she found the thread, he would be there to help her pull it until the whole damn thing unraveled. Ilara plunged into the hunt with a singular, obsessive focus that bordered on mania. Her small, cramped apartment became her new war room, the walls slowly disappearing behind printouts of financial records and grainy photographs of suspected forgeries. Sleep became a luxury she could not afford, a brief interruption in a relentless cycle of research and analysis. She drank bitter black coffee until her hands trembled, her eyes burning from staring at a screen for 18 hours a day. The digital world was a vast, featureless ocean, and she was adrift in it, searching for a single, elusive fish. She cross-referenced every known alias of Vacher's with every major art transaction of the past 2 decades. She built complex spreadsheets, tracking the movement of specific art pieces through a shadowy network of private dealers and discreet auction houses. Days bled into nights. The city outside her window became a distant, muffled soundtrack to her solitary quest. There were moments of crushing despair, times when the sheer scale of Finch's operation, the intricate global network he had built to protect himself, seemed utterly insurmountable. She felt like a lone soldier laying siege to an impregnable fortress. In those moments of doubt, the image of her father's face would rise in her memory. She would remember his hands, strong and gentle, carefully restoring a damaged canvas, bringing beauty back to life. She would remember the light in his eyes when he talked about art, the pure, unadulterated passion he had for truth and history. Finch had not just stolen his money, he had poisoned his passion, replacing a world of beauty with one of cynical, fraudulent transactions. This was not just about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. It was about taking the world that Finch had corrupted and making it whole again. It was about honoring the memory of a man who believed that truth was the most valuable commodity of all. This thought was the fuel that kept her going, the fire that burned away the exhaustion and the fear. She was not just hunting a criminal, she was fighting for her father's soul, and for that she would never, ever give up. After 2 weeks of relentless searching, she had hit a wall. Every digital trail for Jean-Luc Vacher went cold around 3 years ago. He had simply vanished, as if he had walked off the face of the earth. The shell companies he used to use had been dissolved. The middlemen he worked with had disappeared. It was a dead end, a perfectly scrubbed crime scene. Frustration, sharp and bitter, began to gnaw at her. She felt the cold tendrils of despair creeping back in. Perhaps Finch was truly untouchable. Perhaps he had already cleaned house, erasing any link that could possibly lead back to him. It was then that she remembered Professor Albright's other contact, the second weapon in her arsenal, Julian Croft, the disgraced curator. With a renewed sense of purpose, she arranged a meeting, hoping that this ghost from Finch's past could help her find the ghost she was currently hunting. They met in a quiet, forgotten corner of the New York Public Library, surrounded by the hushed reverence of scholarship. Julian Croft was a small, bird-like man with a meticulously trimmed gray beard and the haunted eyes of someone who had lost the thing he loved most in the world. For him, it had been his position at the Met, his life's work. He spoke of Alistair Finch with a quiet, scholarly venom that was far more chilling than any loud outburst of rage. He described Finch's tenure on the museum board as a form of sophisticated vandalism, a constant, bruising battle between the values of cultural preservation and naked commercialism. He confirmed what Albright had suspected. Finch used his position not to serve the museum but to gather intelligence, to identify vulnerabilities in collectors, and to legitimize his own questionable acquisitions through the museum's reputation. He was a fox who had been put in charge of the grandest henhouse in the world. Elara listened, absorbing every detail, but she needed more than just confirmation of Finch's character. She needed a new lead, a new way to find Vacher. She explained her predicament, how the forger's trail had gone cold. Croft listened intently, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "Vacher," he murmured, stroking his beard. "Yes, I remember the name. He was a phantom, but a brilliant one. His particular genius was not just in creation, but in mimicry. He could adopt the style of almost any school. But that's not what made him so valuable." He paused, a flicker of memory in his eyes. His real, unique talent was as a restorer. He could take a damaged, second-rate period piece and restore it so brilliantly, adding subtle but significant details, that he could elevate its value tenfold. He didn't always have to create a forgery from scratch. Sometimes he just had to perfect an existing lie. That was his true signature. That single piece of information was a lightning bolt that illuminated the entire landscape of her investigation. She had been looking for Vacher in the wrong places. She had been searching the criminal underworld, the records of forgeries and illicit sales. But Croft's insight gave her a new, brilliant idea. Vacher would have needed to practice his craft, to keep his skills sharp, to maintain a legitimate cover. He would have taken on real restoration projects under a pseudonym, hiding in plain sight within the legitimate art world. She now had a new set of clues to hunt for, not just Vacher's known forgeries, but his stylistic tics, his preferred chemical compounds, his unique methods of canvas relining and pigment mixing. She was no longer hunting for the man himself. She was hunting for the ghost of his technique, the echo of his hand in the legitimate work of other, lesser restorers. It was a monumental, almost impossible task, but it was a path, and for the first time in weeks, she had a path forward. The next phase of the hunt was the most demanding yet, a true test of her unique and formidable expertise. She spent a week living in the art history archives of the university library, poring over high-resolution images of restoration records from auction houses all over the world. She was looking for a needle in a global haystack. She ignored the names of the restorers, focusing instead on the work itself. She scanned chemical analyses of pigments, looking for the specific potassium permanganate solution Vacher favored for his artificial aging. She examined infrared reflectography images of underdrawings, searching for the hesitant, slightly too perfect lines that were his tell when mimicking the confident hand of a Renaissance master. It was a painstaking, microscopic process, a form of visual forensics that no one else on Earth was as qualified to conduct. She was in her element, the world of academia she had been forced to abandon, but this time her research was not for a grade or a degree, it was for justice. On the 8th day, buried deep in the digital archives of a second-tier London auction house, she found it. It was a minor restoration project from 2 years prior, on a small, unremarkable Dutch landscape painting. The work was credited to a restorer she had never heard of, a man with no other recorded history. But the evidence was unmistakable. There, in the chemical report on a section of repaired sky, was a trace element she recognized, a specific binder Vacher used to give his oil paints a faster drying time. And there, in the X-ray of the canvas, was his signature method of repairing a tear, a subtle cross-hatching pattern that was as unique as a fingerprint. She had him. She had found his ghost. The official paperwork for the restoration listed the client who had commissioned the work, a small, boutique art shipping and logistics company based in Red Hook, Brooklyn. A quick search by Marco revealed the company's primary business was not art logistics. It was a holding company, a subsidiary of a larger corporation that was, in turn, owned by a trust registered in the Cayman Islands. A trust controlled by Alistair Finch. The stakeout was a jarring transition from the hallowed halls of the library to the gritty reality of the Brooklyn waterfront. Ilara and Marco sat for 2 days in his beat-up sedan, the air smelling of salt and diesel, watching the entrance to a nondescript, corrugated steel warehouse. The company's name, Artisan Freight Forwarding, was painted in faded letters above a rolling steel door. It looked like 1,000 other small industrial businesses in the area, but this was the nexus. This was the place where the pristine world of high art and the dirty world of Finch's criminal enterprise intersected. They watched trucks come and go, carrying sealed crates of all shapes and sizes. It was a waiting game, a test of patience and nerve. Ilara felt a strange sense of calm. She was no longer just a researcher. She was an active participant in the field, closing in on her target. The fear she had felt was being replaced by a cold, sharp focus, the focus of a predator that has finally scented its prey. On the evening of the second day, he appeared. A man in his late 60s, with a stooped posture and the nervous, darting eyes of a man who has spent his life looking over his shoulder, emerged from a side door of the warehouse. He was carrying a small, flat wooden box. Marco zoomed in with a long lens camera, snapping a series of photos. He pulled up an old Interpol file on his laptop, a grainy, black and white photo of a much younger Jean-Luc Vacher. The bone structure was the same. The anxious set of his mouth was the same. It was him. The ghost had a face. The phantom had taken on flesh and blood. A jolt of pure, triumphant adrenaline shot through Ilara, so powerful it made her gasp. He was real. He was here. And he was the key to everything. The first and most difficult part of their mission was complete. They had found the forger. Now they just had to make him talk. Approaching Vacher was the most dangerous part of the plan. Marco was adamant that he should be the one to do it, arguing that as a journalist, he had a certain level of protection. But Ilara knew it had to be her. A journalist would be seen as a threat, someone looking for a story. Vacher would retreat, deny everything and disappear again, this time for good. She, on the other hand, was not a threat in the same way. She was a connection to the world he understood, the world of art. She would not approach him with accusations or threats of exposure. She would approach him with something far more disarming and effective, her expertise. Her cover story was simple, elegant, and almost entirely true. She was an art history doctoral candidate, writing her dissertation on the chemical composition of 17th-century varnish techniques, a topic so obscure and academic that it would be instantly believable. She would be a fellow scholar, a kindred spirit, approaching a reclusive master for his guidance. Gaining access to his workshop, which was hidden in the back of the warehouse, required a delicate touch. She spent a day researching his known academic passions, the few legitimate articles he had published under a pseudonym decades ago. She found her opening. He had a particular fascination with the lost techniques of the Flemish masters. She sent an email to a generic address listed for the freight company, addressed to the, quote, chief conservator, a title she invented. In the email, she wrote a detailed, highly technical query about the chemical interaction between lead-tin yellow pigment and oil-based glazes, a problem that had vexed art historians for centuries. She cited one of his old, obscure articles. It was a perfect piece of bait, an appeal to his intellect and his ego. 2 days later, she received a terse, one-line reply, an invitation to visit the workshop for a brief consultation. She was in. Walking into Jean-Luc Vacher's workshop was like stepping into a profane version of her father's studio. The smells were the same: the sharp tang of turpentine, the earthy scent of linseed oil, the sweet, cloying aroma of chemical varnishes. But where her father's studio had been a place of light, of restoration, of bringing truth back to damaged beauty, this place was a laboratory of lies. Canvases in various stages of fraudulent creation were everywhere. A half-finished Fragonard leaned against one wall, its joyous pastel figures still waiting for the final layer of artificial age. A series of ancient Roman coins, freshly struck from a modern mold, sat cooling on a workbench. It was a factory of deception, and the sight of it filled Elara with a cold, profound sadness. This was the source of the poison that had seeped into her family's life, and at its center was the small, nervous man who was now looking at her with a mixture of suspicion and academic curiosity. She did not confront him immediately. She played her part perfectly, discussing the technical points of. The Museum of Modern Art was a cathedral of glass and steel, a temple dedicated to the new gods of the 21st century, disruption, innovation, and capital. Tonight, Alistair Finch was its high priest. The gala for the announcement of his merger with Omnicorp was the apotheosis of his life's work, a celebration of a deal worth $12 billion. The air hummed with the energy of immense power and even more immense wealth, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, hushed negotiations, and the flash of cameras capturing the faces of the global elite. Finch stood on a minimalist stage, a massive abstract painting behind him like a chaotic halo, basking in the adoration of his peers. He was not just a CEO, he was a conqueror, and this was his victory parade. He spoke of synergy and shareholder value, his voice smooth and confident, the very picture of an untouchable titan at the apex of his power. He did not know that a ghost from his past, a ghost he had created and forgotten, was walking among the disciples in his temple, preparing to tear it all down with a single, well-aimed stone of truth. Elara moved through the crowd not as a phantom, but as a presence. She was not wearing the invisible uniform of a waitress, but a simple, sharp, dark blue dress, a garment that spoke of professionalism, not opulence. Her hair was pulled back, her face was clear of all but the most minimal makeup, and her eyes held a calm, terrifying clarity. She carried a simple clutch, but inside it, on a small, encrypted flash drive, was the weapon that would end a war. She had secured press credentials from Marco, her name listed under a small, independent financial blog, an identity that allowed her to be present but remain unnoticed until the perfect moment. As she watched Finch on stage, preening and accepting the applause, she felt no fear, no anxiety. The frantic, desperate energy of the past few weeks had consolidated into a single, cold point of pure purpose. In her mind, she saw her father, not as a victim, but as he was in his prime, his eyes alight with passion, as he explained the delicate genius of a Vermeer. She was here for him. She was his voice. She was his vindication, the presentation concluded, and the floor was open for a brief Q&A session. A hand-picked journalist from a major financial network asked a softball question about market projections. Finch answered with practiced ease, a charming, self-deprecating remark drawing a ripple of appreciative laughter from the audience. Then, from the side of the room, another hand was raised. It was Ilara. The moderator, not recognizing her, hesitated for a moment before gesturing for a microphone to be brought to her. A spotlight found her, and a hush fell over a small section of the room as people turned to look at this unknown woman. On stage, Finch squinted against the light, a flicker of annoyance on his face at this unscheduled interruption. He did not recognize her. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a nobody. He leaned into the microphone, a magnanimous, condescending smile on his lips. "Yes? A quick question, if you please. We have a lot to celebrate tonight. The stage was set, the trap was sprung." Ilara took the microphone, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear, so perfectly modulated, that it cut through the ambient chatter of the cavernous room, carrying to every corner. Every head turned. Her voice was amplified by the museum's state-of-the-art sound system, a sound of quiet, lethal precision. "Mr. Finch," she began, her eyes locked on his. "My name is Ilara Vance." She let the name hang in the air for a moment, a name that meant nothing to him, but everything to her. "We met recently at Aurelia. I was your waitress." A murmur went through the crowd, a mixture of confusion and intrigue. Finch's smile tightened, a flash of genuine anger in his eyes at this public mention of a service encounter. He remembered her now, the insolent waitress. He began to signal for security, but Ilara was already continuing, her pace quickening, her words building an irrefutable case. "You were attempting to use a small marble sculpture as collateral in a business deal, a piece you claimed was from the 15th century. As I told you then, it was a forgery, created by a man named Jean-Luc Vacher. Tonight, you are celebrating a merger that values your company's assets in the billions. A significant portion of those assets, listed in your SEC filings, is your private art collection, the same collection that sculpture belongs to. My question is this: how much of your $12 billion empire is built on the same cheap poison you tried to serve that night?" Before Finch or the panicked moderator could cut her off, she gave a small nod to Marco, who was standing near the audio-visual booth. Suddenly, the massive screen behind Finch, which had been displaying the gleaming logo of the new corporate entity, flickered and changed. An image appeared, a high-resolution photograph of the forged sculpture from the restaurant, with red arrows pointing to the telltale marks of modern power tools she had described. Finch's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to call it a lie, but then the screen changed again. A scanned document appeared, a shipping manifest from Artisan Freight Forwarding, detailing the delivery of a sealed crate from a workshop in Lyon, France, to a private storage facility owned by a shell corporation. The recipient of the invoice for that shipment, visible at the bottom of the page, was Alistair Finch. The crowd gasped, a collective, audible shockwave. The screen changed again. A complex web of offshore accounts, a dizzying flowchart of arrows and names, showing a payment of €200,000 from a Cayman Islands trust controlled by Finch to an account in Switzerland belonging to Jean-Luc Vacher. Finch was trapped, literally illuminated by the evidence of his crimes. He stood frozen, his mouth agape, his carefully constructed world dissolving into pixels and light behind him. He looked like a man who had been stabbed in the back, unable to comprehend the source of the blow. But Ilara was not finished. The final image appeared on the screen, and this one was not a document, but a video. It was a grainy, time-stamped deposition, taken 5 years ago. The face of a broken man filled the screen. Her father's former business partner, his voice trembling with grief and shame. He described how a charismatic new investor had sold them a collection of incredible Renaissance pieces on consignment, how the pieces had later been exposed as fakes, how the scandal had bankrupted them, and how that same investor had used a proxy company to buy the gallery's real estate for almost nothing. And who was that investor? The off-screen lawyer asked. The man on the screen looked directly into the camera, his eyes full of a sorrow that transcended time. His name was Alistair Finch. The video ended, and the screen went black, leaving only Finch's terrified, ashen face illuminated on the stage. The silence in the room was absolute, a profound, damning vacuum, where a celebration had been just moments before. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Ilara finally exposed the truth. The downfall was not a slow decline, it was a catastrophic collapse, an implosion that happened in the space of 120 seconds. The silence in the museum was broken by a cacophony of sound. The frantic clicking of 100 camera shutters, the urgent murmur of voices as billionaires spoke into their phones, canceling deals, dumping stock, severing ties. Finch's business partner from the restaurant, the older man with watchful eyes, stood up from his front row seat, his face a mask of cold fury, and walked out without a word, his exit a public and unmistakable verdict. Finch stood on the stage paralyzed, as his empire, his reputation, and his life were publicly executed. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. He looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had adored him moments ago, and saw only contempt, disgust, and the cold, predatory calculation of rivals sensing a fatal wound. His power had been an illusion, a magic trick, and Ilara had just shown everyone in the world exactly how it was done. As security guards finally rushed the stage to escort him away from the media swarming towards him, two quiet, unassuming figures in dark suits stepped forward to intercept them, flanking Finch on either side. They didn't grab him. They didn't need to. One of them simply said his name and showed him a small, discreet badge. Federal agents. They had been waiting, alerted by Marco just before the presentation began, and Ilara had delivered them their entire case on a silver platter. The last image the world saw of Alistair Finch was not of a titan, but of a small, broken man being quietly led away from his own coronation, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and utter ruin. The months that followed were a blur of headlines and legal proceedings. Finch's empire crumbled to dust, buried under an avalanche of federal indictments for wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, along with a tidal wave of civil lawsuits from the dozens of people he had defrauded over the years. The name Vance, once synonymous with disgrace, was now a symbol of integrity and courage. David Vance's name was cleared, his reputation posthumously restored, his story now told as a cautionary tale of a good man targeted by a predator. One afternoon, Ilara received a call. It was from the quiet, older man who had been dining with Finch at Aurelia, a respected industrialist named Arthur Sterling. He had been a silent observer that night, and a witness to Ilara's brilliance at the gala. He did not offer condolences or praise. He made a business proposition. He told her he was appalled by the rot she had exposed, a rot he knew ran deep in the world of high-stakes collecting. He was establishing a new foundation, a well-funded corporate division dedicated to art authentication, ethical acquisitions, and the recovery of stolen or fraudulent art. He wanted her to run it. It was not a job offer born of pity, it was a recognition of her unique world-class talent. He was offering her a platform to use her gift not as a weapon of vengeance, but as an instrument of justice. 6 months later, Ilara stood at the window of her new office on the 52nd floor of the Sterling Tower, looking down at the city. From this vantage point, she could just see the corner of Madison Avenue where her father's gallery had once stood, a place of vibrant beauty and crushing loss. But the memory no longer brought a sharp, debilitating pain. It brought a sense of peace, of a circle finally closed. Her office was bright and filled with light, the walls lined not with forgeries but with books. On her large, clean desk, there was a single framed photograph of her and Emily, laughing, taken just last week at Emily's college graduation. Next to it was an older, faded photo of her father, his smile kind and proud. She was no longer a ghost, no longer invisible. She was Alara Vance, the director of the Vance Institute for Art Integrity, a name chosen by Sterling to honor her father's legacy. She had reclaimed her family's name, secured her sister's future, and forged a new path for herself, one where her intellect and her passion were not a secret burden, but a force for good in the world. She had walked through the fire of grief and humiliation, and emerged not burned but tempered, stronger, and more brilliant than before. Her journey had been a testament to a simple, profound truth, that true power is not measured in billions of dollars or in the height of skyscrapers, but in the courage to speak truth in the face of lies. It is found in the quiet, unyielding strength of a daughter's love for her father, a love that could not be extinguished by scandal or death. Alara Vance had proven that the most dangerous person in any room is the one that arrogance overlooks, the one who has been listening, remembering, and waiting. Her story was a reminder that justice may be delayed, but for those who are brave enough to fight for it, it can never be truly denied. She had not only exposed a villain, she had restored a legacy, and in doing so, she had finally, truly come home. If Alara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.